Hello, my name is Steve Green. I am the AFCM Regional Director for Alberta and British Columbia here in Canada. My wife is with us off screen. We welcome you to our veranda on this beautiful summer morning. I'd like to speak today for a few minutes on the subject of salvation, and in particular that salvation has several different aspects. Three aspects I want to mention today are justification, sanctification, and the glorification of our physical bodies. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 11, Paul says to the Corinthians, "You were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified." Sanctified means to be made holy. Justified means to be made righteous. Paul here is speaking of a position or a status or a gift that has been given to the Corinthians. They are justified, but they're not acting righteous yet. They're not acting very holy yet. They're spiritual babes and they're disobedient, and yet they are saved. They have been justified. Looking to Matthew chapter 28 and verses 18 to 20, the Great Commission, Jesus says to make disciples of all nations, teaching them to observe all things that He has commanded us. Obedience is important to Jesus. First of all, He wants us to learn to be obedient, to be made disciples. And then He wants us to then make disciples, to teach others to observe all things that Jesus has commanded. Let's turn to Hebrews chapter 5 and to another church, also similar to the Corinthians, a disobedient church. Paul says concerning them that they're dull of hearing in chapter 5 and verse 11, that they're spiritual babes, that they have need of milk and not solid food, and that they're unskilled in the word of righteousness. In verse 12, he says, by this time they ought to be teachers. They ought to be making disciples as Jesus commanded us to do. However, they still need to again be taught the first principles of the oracles of God. This means that again they're still babes, they're disobedient, they're not ready to make disciples, they need to be made disciples themselves, and by this time they should not be in that situation. So the writer is not condemning them, but he does wish to explain to them how to become holy, functionally holy, how to be sanctified in a functional sense. Number one, and this is the end of chapter 3 and the beginning of chapter 4, he reminds them of the wilderness generation under Moses. They did not believe that the land could truly be theirs. They did not have faith, and therefore they did not obey. And because they did not obey, they did not get their reward. They did not enter into God's rest. The writer explains to them that their situation is the same. They need to be obedient to God's call upon their lives in order to experience the reward. Number two, so first of all, sanctification is through faith. Number two, it's by grace. In chapter 4 and verse 16, he, having just spoken in verse 15 of their weaknesses, of their temptations to disobedience, he says, "Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace to obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need." So grace is there for us to assist us, to strengthen us to be obedient or to be sanctified. Number three, holiness or sanctification is not of ourselves. It says in verse 10 that he that has entered into his rest has ceased from his own works. And so we're no longer following our own works, living life our own way, but we're following his works. And so obedience, holiness or sanctification comes, number one, through faith. Number two, it's by grace. And number three, it's not of ourselves. And there is a reward or an entering into rest to those who are sanctified. In chapter 7 of Hebrews, in verse 25, a very interesting verse, he says, "Therefore he is also able to save," and so this is our subject, salvation. "He's able to save to the uttermost those who come to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them." always living to make intercession. That is not saying that Jesus is always praying in heaven to God for us, but rather he says he always lives, meaning he's always ready for us to come to God through him, to come boldly to the throne of grace. Whenever we come, he's ready to make sure that we receive the grace that we need in order to be sanctified, in order to enter into God's rest, and as he puts it in this verse, in order to be saved. There's other places in the first few chapters of Hebrews where the word salvation is used in exactly this way. In chapter 2 and verses 1 to 3, we're told that we must give the more earnest heed to the things that we have heard. This is in order to avoid transgression, in order to avoid disobedience. And then he asks, how shall we escape if we neglect so great salvation? Salvation, this salvation, sanctification, comes by obedience. The second place where, again, this word salvation is used to describe sanctification is a few verses later, in verses 10 and 11 of chapter 2. He describes Jesus as the one who sanctifies us. He is the captain of our salvation. Number 3, in chapter 5 and verse 9, he says he is the author of eternal salvation to those who obey him. And a fourth instance of the word salvation being used in this sense is chapter 6, verses 9 and 10, where the writer says he is confident that they will experience the blessings of salvation because they have ministered and do minister to the saints. So we're looking again at the second aspect of salvation, which is sanctification. These are the good things that happen to people who function in a holy manner. So again, sanctification and entering into God's rest and salvation, it's number one, by grace, it's through faith, and it's not of ourselves. This, of course, agrees with Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 8, where we read, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God." The phrase in English, have been saved, is the single Greek word sisosmenoi, which is a perfect passive participle, meaning that it's speaking of a completed action. They have been saved, but it has ongoing effects or continuing results. These continuing results are also by grace and through faith. And so then we see that salvation, again, is an umbrella term encompassing different aspects. It's like a race. A race has a starting line, which in our case would be justification. There's the actual race, which is sanctification. And then there's the finish line, which is one we haven't mentioned so much so far, the glorification of our physical bodies. Here's one final illustration. It would be like a rescue at sea. Imagine there's a ship. It's going down, it's sinking, it's doomed, and you are on it. However, a rescue vessel comes, and you are removed from the sinking vessel. You're placed on the rescue vessel. You have been saved. That would be like justification. Now you're on the rescue vessel and it's making its way to shore. As it's heading towards shore, you are being saved. That would be like sanctification. And of course, finally, you make it to shore. Your feet are now on solid ground. You have been saved. That would be representative of the glorification of our physical bodies. I trust that this is a blessing to you. It has been a blessing to you. It's been a privilege to share with you the Word of God.